Hello and welcome back to the Football Heritage Podcast. I'm your host, Rory Bryce, and I'm joined once again on this very sunny evening, at least north of the border, by Finlay Stanley, aka AFC Finners. Finlay, it's a pleasure to have you back on the show. How are you doing today, mate?
Very good, thanks. Excited for Saturday's FA Cup final. Fingers crossed Palace can cause an upset, but yeah, very good to be back.
Yeah, I would absolutely love it for Palace to end up winning the trophy. I think it would be like the sort of perfect full circle moment for how City's season has been, to be beaten by a club who always perennially seem to finish 12th, it seems, or there or thereabouts. Do you know what I mean? But Palace have had this really kind of nice turnaround in form lately, and I mean their 3-0 win in the last round in the semi-final was absolutely incredible. So you never know. I want to say I'm hopeful. I mean, I don't really know. I don't follow English football that closely, but you'd like to think that they can go out there and cause a bit of an upset, couldn't you?
Yeah, it's one of those things where, I think a bit like with when Newcastle won the League Cup this season, when Leicester won the FA Cup a few years ago, you kind of think, no, they failed too many times for it to happen again. The script writers have to... We're in the third act now. They can't lose again. Fingers crossed.
I know. That's the thing with cup football, though. Anything can happen, and it's part of the beauty of it. And nicely, I suppose, that is what we are going to be talking about today. We are going to be talking about everything cup football, and specifically everything the FA Cup, but not just cup upsets, not just these big games which we all end up talking about for years to come, although they will play a part in the conversation that we're going to have. We are going to be talking about the entire history of the FA Cup, the trophy into the modern day, and the memories that it's provided us all. But as Finlay has covered in an article for us, which was released last October, certainly last year, last September and October, we're going to be talking about the culture of the FA Cup. And by culture, we mean things like the run-up to the day itself, the fact that regardless of whoever is playing in the final, regardless of what team, whether you support them or not, half, if not all of your family are around the TV watching the game. It being this kind of showpiece fixture within the calendar of every single season, it does mark the end of the season. Of course, we need to acknowledge that, and that's part of the culture of it. But how this sort of intangible culture has created this really brilliant sort of feeling around the FA Cup, and I think anyway plays into the concept of the magic of the cup. So we're going to be talking about all those wonderful things that make the FA Cup what it is, and the fixture, the final, what it is and what it means to all of us as well. Finlay, just before we kick things off, though, I know you've been on the show before. Obviously, you came on to talk with us about Joe Fagan earlier on in the year. But do you just want to give our listeners a little recap about who you are and what it is that you do?
Yeah, so I have a YouTube channel called, obviously, AFC Finners. I started it off as a football history channel where we cover obscure topics, not obscure topics, quite similar to what Rory does. But I've also, since it started, balanced out with ground hopping and match day vlogs, where we go up and down the country, view the match day experience. So yeah, it's a balance of football history and football culture across the footballing world, but love covering topics and helping cement their legacy and also showing people what match day experience is all about. So yeah, it's a footballing mecca.
No, I totally agree. There's some really brilliant videos and some other really fantastic content that you've put out there, so please keep up the good work. And obviously you've contributed a few articles for us as well. As I said, Abide With Me, the article about the FA Cup, the article on Ernst Happel, which was really fascinating as well, actually, because he wasn't a person that I knew an awful lot about. And of course, the episode on Joe Fagan earlier in the year, which I've already mentioned. Another person who I didn't know too much about, just past his name and the fact that he won the treble. So it's always great to learn from other people who are kind of creating content within the same sort of spheres that we do. And I think being able to learn from each other is really important as well. So it's brilliant to have you back on the show to be talking about everything related to the FA Cup. And I'm guessing by the fact that you've already done an article for this for us, the FA Cup is something that you hold quite close to your heart, and something that I imagine anyway, the sort of intangible phenomenons around the FA Cup are something that are quite close to you and are quite interesting to you.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it's always been something I've absolutely loved watching. There was just always a huge buzz when it was an FA Cup weekend on the telly, whether that be the third round, semi-finals or finals. But there was just a euphoria around it that no other tournament could give me, and I've just always got such joy out of reading about the history of it. There's excitement I get no other when it is an FA Cup weekend that hasn't left me since I was watching football as a kid. and just the romanticism, the history of it, what it means to the world of football. The world of football wouldn't be what it was without the FA Cup. And I think there's still a lot of magic there. I can understand a lot of people saying why the FA Cup isn't what it once was. And I do get those points, and I agree to some extent. But I think there's still a lot of magic there. But yeah, I just think it's a competition like no other. And it's something that I've always absolutely loved. And people who know me personally know how much I absolutely love it. You know, the FA Cup final is like Christmas Day for me. So it really holds a special place in my heart.
Yeah, for sure. There's quite an awful lot to unpack in that sentence as well, that the magic of the FA Cup is something that has been lost somewhat, and it's not the same as it used to be. So that's something that we'll definitely touch on a bit later as well, because that can mean different things to so many different people. And I'm really fascinated to dig into that. As I said, Ken, at the beginning of this episode, I don't really follow English football, if I'm being honest. If there's a fixture on TV and if I'm bored, then I'll watch it. Obviously, I'm very invested in Scottish football. But the FA Cup, because it's always televised, is the competition that I will watch the most of throughout a season, give or take. And I think that's where my enjoyment in English football comes, is because it's a little bit more unpredictable. There's a little bit more magic around it. And I think if we go back to the origins of the FA Cup, when it was founded and why it was founded, that thread of magic still continues on to this day, albeit I will agree with you that some of it has been lost along the way. So, you know, the FA Cup was founded in 1873, and it was really a way to bring all of English football together to give them something to compete for. And it's kind of similar to how the Scottish Cup was founded in that sense as well. This was before the founding of any kind of national league. You had what were known as combination leagues. You had what were kind of regionalised leagues and local leagues, but there wasn't anything really professional at this point that the entire country could play in. So the FA Cup was really the national English competition. And I think 1873 actually makes it one of, if not the oldest cup competition in the world.
Well, you're absolutely right in terms of the reasons it was founded, because it was essentially, before the foundation of it, fixtures are sort of a bit mishmash. It's sort of a bit like, you know, when you played football at school and every couple of weeks you might just randomly play another school in a friendly. But it was sort of a bit like that, but there wasn't like there wasn't much at stake in the games you were playing. It was just a friendly, oh cool, see you next time. And it was a bit like what, you know, rugby union was for a very long time. And you can see how the FA Cup advanced football to that extent. But as you see in my article, it was Charles Alcock, when he was at Harrow School, he pointed out that when they played association football, that they had a sort of knockout tournament. So he proposed the idea of it. And initially it was quite poorly received. I believe only 13 teams, unless I'm mistaken, took part in the first edition. But it did take a bit of time to get going. Once people realised what was on show, the attendances they could get, the numbers did certainly start to pick up. But no, at first it sort of seemed like it was something that would never really grow beyond infancy. But it was a masterstroke that really did change the world of football. But it's just when there was something to compete for, a prize. And obviously for a lot of these clubs, those were the only games that they played, because there wasn't a league system when it first came in. So, you know, by doing that, it helped generate an opportunity and like a match day that, you know, the proceeds would find their way down. But yeah, it was a means of progressing English football, and by goodness, it made a difference.
100%. What is fun, because what I like about the sort of early days of the FA Cup is that you have these really interesting quirks in the competition. For example, Scottish teams taking part. And if I'm not mistaken, it was one of the first FA Cups that Queen's Park actually made it to the final, forced a replay, but they couldn't afford to travel down to play them because of the amount of money they would have to spend, so they had to forfeit, and therefore they won the final. And it would just be quite interesting to see how that would have progressed if a Scottish club would have actually ended up winning the FA Cup. And again, that's something that it's a huge sliding doors moment. I mean, that could have paved the way for a UK-wide competition or a Scotland and English competition, do you know what I mean? So it's interesting that there was all these early quirks. But like you said, it took a little while to kind of find its feet and take off. But once it did, all of a sudden, within a few years, you had hundreds, if not thousands of teams actually competing in it, which is just incredible.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It was a big boom moment for English football. And like you say, it's a shame that the Scottish teams couldn't have got more involved, because obviously you see like Cardiff City winning it And as a result, several Welsh clubs have been part of English football. But with what you mentioned there about like travel expenses was a moment where it did make a big difference because football is known as a working man's game. But also I mentioned Charles Alcock was from Harrow. It was initially like the people who played it initially were very much middle class. But this is an issue that the game had in the sense that the southern teams would tend to be made up of people who were bankers, lawyers, doctors, well paid professions such as that. And if they had to take a day off work to take part in the cup, it wasn't an issue for them. But the northern teams, you had people who worked in factories down the mines, and if they took a day off work to travel down south, they could lose their job, they couldn't pay their rents. I'm not sure if you've seen it, but the Netflix series The English Game does a very good job of covering this. It does take some artistic license, but it does make a good point as to the lengths that different people are going to. And I mentioned rugby, the big split between those two sports was that you'll notice like rugby league is in the north of England, rugby union, a lot of it is in the south. They had a similar dispute, and as a result, the sport ended up splitting. English football thankfully managed to find a way, but it was in the FA Cup where a lot of this happens. Look what happened in the article and in the TV series. You had a lot of teams who couldn't take part in replays in the FA Cup because they couldn't afford the expenses. And Fergus Suter, one of the most important men in FA Cup history, took a job in a mill, but seemed to be paid quite handsomely when he was playing for a team. And, there's a lot of people saying he was getting under-table payments, and it happened with other players too. And it was very nearly a case of a breakaway league was formed where players could be paid professionally, but the FA relented, and we have football as it is now, but you could end up having like a football league, football union situation, and united we stand, divided we fall. But yeah, it was very much the class divide was a huge issue, but the world was becoming a smaller place. The invention of the railroad made a big difference, and I think the FA Cup helped to bridge the gap and allowed people from the north who perhaps didn't have the luxury that some people in the south have experienced those highs and lows, because obviously the big success was Blackburn Olympic and then Blackburn Rovers being the first teams from the north. That was a huge shift of the culture of football. It suddenly became the working person's game, and it meant all these people who worked all day busting their backsides off at the mill, getting their faces covered in soot down the mine, suddenly they had something outside of that to get out of the bed for on the weekend and look forward to at the end of the week. And with that then became the supporters that wanted to cheer people on and again just have something to look forward to at the end of the week and bring communities together. So the FA Cup was the start of that, and it made a big difference in making football what it is across the world now.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with everything that you've said there. It's fascinating how this thing that when it started out wasn't very well received, took its time to get off the ground, actually ended up having such an impact to the point where even when the EFL was formed and the first organised national leagues across England started to be competed for, the FA Cup was still the trophy that everyone wanted to win, and in some cases even prioritised over the league standings.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It was very much how people would see the Champions League, perhaps even more, because I think most teams would prefer to win the league title than the Champions League. But yeah, no, it was absolutely the supreme trophy to win. Everyone was desperate to see it won. But as it developed, it obviously became like a whole day for a nation, to the point where Wembley was essentially built for the sole purpose of that one day, because it got such big attendances at the Kennington Oval and then the Crystal Palace Stadium. Not where Crystal Palace play now, they did play there briefly, but it still exists. It's near, if anyone's been to London, there's the very famous park with the model dinosaurs in Crystal Palace. It's just around the corner from there. It's just a standard sports leisure stadium now. But yeah, that was essentially the original Wembley. But yeah, the actual Wembley was built because the FA Cup final was such a big day that they decided it needed its own stadium. And they built this huge stadium in Wembley. But obviously, typical FA didn't plan it very well. Thought they didn't need to ticket it, it wouldn't get overcrowded. It did. People invaded the pitch. And you had the famous White Horse final where a police officer came on the pitch with his white horse to disperse the crowds. But eventually the game did go ahead and Bolton beat West Ham 2-0. But again, that says a lot. It was such a big day that you actually had to build the stadium for it.
Exactly. The Bolton and the West Ham one's interesting. Like, we've all seen the photos of the pitch invasion and the fans spreading onto the pitch. Incredible stuff. And I think that's the thing about the FA Cup, is that although it has this really interesting history, and through it we can really study the roots of the game in England and how it became organised. And, to an extent, Scotland and Wales as well, because we kind of followed suit in a way that was very, very similar, and to an extent still do. But through the years, despite the fact that the league then ended up taking prominence, and as English football became more organised, even after the advent of the League Cup and a number of other different trophies that have come and went, the FA Cup has remained as the cup tournament, the knockout tournament that people want to compete for, even though, in this day and age, it's the Premier League that everyone wants to win. And back then, up until a certain time, the FA Cup was still the trophy that everyone wanted to compete for, but eventually the league took over. But everyone still loves the FA Cup, and there's some very distinct reasons for that, and it's because, we've spoken about these things like the magic of the cup, the culture surrounding it. It's just a fantastic event. It's a fantastic thing that fans of all clubs can get behind and actually see their team compete for. Do you know what I mean? And even though it's changed very much now with the kind of pyramid system and the clubs at different steps and that side of things, it's still just brilliant being able to watch it and actually see all these people taking part in what must be one of the only kind of nationally celebrated cup competitions in the world.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think the accessibility of it certainly plays a big part, because for all the changes that have been made to the FA Cup in recent years, you do have the advantage that it's never gone behind a paywall, and I think that's really good. But no, absolutely, it's great to see all these people on TV. Like this year you had, do forgive me, I can't remember the name off the top of my head, but there was obviously a team that got to the third round and managed to hold Tottenham to a draw. They went to extra time. But from my personal experience of it as well, my local side, Cheltenham, of a positive early footballing memory. They got to the third round of the FA Cup, and if everybody's seen the Damned United, where Derby draw Leeds in the FA Cup, it's a little bit like that. But Cheltenham got Tottenham away, and me and my friends, we were all about 15 at the time, were absolutely over the moon to be going to a match, a stadium that we see every week on Match of a Day, see Harry Redknapp and Jermaine Defoe in the flesh. It was absolutely incredible. But yeah, we did it, and obviously White Hart Lane is no longer there. But from that experience, being able to do something like that, it was magic, just being able to see a ground like that in person. But yeah, just the sheer excitement of when you see a giant mishmash, a bit like when you had Marine against Tottenham a few years ago. But obviously, like the giant killings you see everywhere, and it's like, there'll also always be ones like Sutton and Lincoln's incredible runs, Plymouth knocking out Liverpool this season. But this is what I mean. There's still a lot of magic seek and you shall find. But if you go to the early rounds, you often get clubs knocking out teams that are several divisions above the other, and it's just always magnificent. But like, even I was at the Cheltenham game where Alvechurch knocked them out of the FA Cup, and all my friends supporting Cheltenham weren't happy with it. But it's still like great that something like that can happen, that a non-league side can knock out a Football League team and be able to reap the benefits of going through to the rounds. But yeah, I think the accessibility is absolutely vital. It's not gone behind a paywall, and it's something that can give people this exposure. But in a weird way, it's become full circle, because obviously, like the past 10 years or so, the Premier League has been very accessible for people. But now, with the diluted streaming services, it being on too many channels for people to afford, for a lot of people, again, the only access is the FA Cup, which was how it was for me for a lot of it when I was a kid, and probably would have been the case for a lot of people in like the 70s and 80s growing up. It would be FA Cup games are how you got to see players. So interestingly, it seems to have come all the way round. But yeah, the TV experience is absolutely massive. It still is a massive event. And, the FA Cup final is a very special date in my diary. Like last year we did... What are the key things I do is like funny if I'm at I take part in a rugby club on Mondays, but I was talking about the FA Cup final, and one of them kind of said, "Oh, it's not the same as it was when I was a kid. We used to sit in front of the telly all day and watch the build-up." And I was like, exactly. So I'm going to make sure that doesn't go away. So what I did last year, I decided to gather up some family and friends. So about 13 of us, my grandparents, my dad, my mates, my cousins, uncles. We all got together, sat in front of the telly, watched it all day, drinking tea and Bovril and all that. Just nice British tradition. I just felt, well, we'll keep this alive. We'll make it a big day. And I'm doing the same on Saturday, getting family round. We'll sit in front of the telly together and watch the whole thing. Let's make a day of it. It is what you make of it, and seek and you shall find. Again, completely fair to people say it's not what it is, but I think you can still make an effort to make it be the thing that you want it to be.
Yeah, it is what you make it, but I also like this idea of seeking you shall find, because it's like so many people talk about how we're losing part of what football is, and so many people look backwards to, just off the top of my head, like the Barclaymans thing that was a big thing on social media for a while. All these nostalgic things. It's like people are saying, "Oh, we're looking back to this because we feel disillusioned with the modern game." And don't get me wrong, I do feel a bit of that, and that is a valid opinion to have. But there are still these little kernels of what we would call proper football. But you do need to put a bit of effort in to actually find it and have that feeling back. And I love this idea that you're actually gathering people and making it a social event, because that's ultimately what the FA Cup would have been all about when television started rolling out across the country and people started watching the FA Cup. These were in the days when like there would be one television per street. And my granddad spoke about it when he'd have like people from the entire cul-de-sac he lived in, basically like 40 odd people crowded around his TV watching. And yeah, it's funny because I remember like sitting in my uni flat with people, and when the FA Cup became available on iPlayer, we would be able to sit and watch it in like our hall's kitchen or whatever, gathered around the TV, and it was a reason for a social event, if that makes sense as well. So it's quite nice that even if you're not entirely invested in it, it's something that you always go to because it has this reputation as being a bit of a showpiece event and something that kind of just ultimately brings people together. It's good to sit and reminisce with people and speak about these fixtures that have happened before. So it is a really big social thing, and I think kind of talking about that period coming out of the 50s and 60s when there were so many shocks, obviously Nottingham Forest, you had Coventry as well, I think.
But yeah, you had 2 years in a row where you had Coventry and then Wimbledon winning it. Like, what an incredible pair of FA Cup finals to have experienced. That's what I mean. I think, like, you go back for each year, and there's something like West Ham as well in the 1980s. They were the last team from outside top flight to win it. Ipswich winning their only FA Cup in 78. Southampton winning it as the underdogs in 76. Leeds winning it as the underdogs in 73. You see what I mean? I didn't even think about these coming into the podcast, and they're just all there. Like, you immediately end up down this rabbit hole of all these shocks that have happened.
No, 100%. And I think that's what's brilliant. And again, I was kind of jumping between decades there, but I think it's these events, and I think especially the kind of cup upsets as it came to be known, which have happened through the years, which have contributed to this idea of the magic of the cup. And it is one of these intangible things, but everyone knows what the magic of the cup is. It's seeing lower league grounds on TV or visiting them as an away fan, grounds that you wouldn't normally get to visit. Even better if they're out with the EFL and playing non-league. It's about seeing these smaller teams giving everything to win the game, even if they don't end up winning it, even if it's by like a last minute, if they can see the last minute goal, it's still about watching them putting everything into the fixture that they're playing, and then actually maybe even seeing an upset happen itself, seeing the fans going crazy. But then thinking about the benefits that can bring to smaller teams as well, it is just a really, really beautiful thing. And I think it's quite a unique cultural thing, which is really specific to football and like our supporters,
Yeah, no, absolutely. And there's a lot of good examples in relatively recent history of clubs who have benefited from that. For example, Burton Albion probably would never have been able to go to Championship had they not held Manchester United to a draw in the FA Cup. They ended up paying off their stadium because of that. And as a result of the proceeds, they've been able to rise up to heights that nobody would have expected to them. Exeter City have had a similar thing. And Histon United is a good example. Like, wherever they are now, Leeds United have just got to the Premier League again. Histon can always say they knocked them out of the FA Cup. You had Crawley's FA Cup run a long time ago. Obviously mentions Lincoln and Sutton. But yeah, no, it's absolutely about the ability to see these non-league grounds on the telly. I remember again, like Cheltenham against Manchester City, it was nice to see the grounds that I'd gone to so much as a kid be on the telly. I know it's absolutely fantastic. You get these mismatches and giant killings, and it's just, again, but the thing is, you compare it as well to some of the other cups, and like with the Coppa Italia, for example, it's such a distorted like system where the teams in the top flight tend not to play each other until the late rounds, by which point most of the teams in the lower leagues have knocked each other out. But the English system is set up perfectly so that teams can play each other and like lower league teams can reap the proceeds of it. So it's a good way of the money from the top trickling down to lower leagues. And, again, we mentioned Marine against Tottenham. I believe Marine have basically secured themselves for the next decade from the proceeds of that game, which technically didn't even have any supporters in the grounds, but there were just so many people viewing on the telly. It's made a massive difference. So yeah, it's a great way for the proceeds on the top to find their way down to lower leagues and just help the lower league teams get their piece of the pie.
Am I right in saying that every single football club in England competes for the FA Cup? Because I know I was speaking with this recently, or fairly recently, with some of the guys that, when we go to our local junior team in Scotland, of course, I say before, junior not being the age, but junior being the level of football being played. It's not senior. It's effectively what our non-league is now. And a club that play in the division below our local team entered the Scottish Cup, but the club that we go and see didn't. And I think there's a system in place where you can effectively register your interest to play in the Scottish Cup at whatever level that may be. But, maybe if the club can't afford it or the fixture schedule is too congested, or if they maybe want to stick more to what the junior football clubs did, which was compete for the Scottish Junior Cup, then they have the option to do that as well. But then there's also the issue that some of them don't actually meet the criteria to enter the Scottish Cup. So it's a bit of a kind of really muddy system that goes on there. And it's also not regionalised like the League Cup has become. So you could have teams playing, Dumfries playing a club from John O'Groats, for instance, or I think there was one fixture one year where Coldstream, who are based on the border, had to play Wick, who are based the North Coast. Do you know what I mean? So yeah, well. It's absolutely insane. And for two clubs at that level, that's a huge travel expense. I mean, you're talking a 9-hour trip each way. Do you know what I mean? So we've got it a little bit messier. I don't know if that's how the format of the FA Cup is in England, because I know you also have things like pre-qualifying rounds and things like that.
Yeah, you do. It is very similar from what you said. There are pre-qualifying rounds and stuff. But that's one of the things that's great. Like, by the time you've reached September, it's like you look at the stats and you already see that this player has got 10 goals in the FA Cup and the first round hasn't happened yet. But there can be massive bonuses to clubs. Like you say, they're like sometimes clubs get like 9-hour drives, but it often is like the risk can be worth it. But one thing I really like about it is that when it comes to the final day and the teams walk out onto the pitch, you can look at the tournament and think, I was a part of that. Because, for example, this season, we went to Highworth against Bishop's Cleeve. Highworth are based in Wiltshire near Swindon. Bishop's Cleeve is about a 20-minute drive for me. It's just it's the ground's a stone's throw from my local rugby club. And it's just great. So I went to their game, and it must have been July, August. Bishop's Cleeve won 1-0. But, I went with me and my mate, and I brought my dog as well. And it's just nice to know that, at the start of this season, I was watching a game in this competition with my dog next to me, and it's come all this way. There's not another tournament that you can get that feeling. So I think that's something really special. But yeah, the early rounds are absolutely fantastic. I think they do pass by for a lot of people. But the BBC, to its credit, does such a fantastic job of covering the FA Cup and making sure the early rounds get coverage. There's been so many times where there'll be like 20 different games going on at once, and the BBC says you can watch this game, this game, this game, this game, and I often do tune in and just watch them. But again, this is what I mean, seek and you shall find. Like in the early rounds of the FA Cup, the BBC does a really good job of covering it and making it accessible for people. So I definitely recommend checking the early rounds out. You never know what you'll see, and you might find grounds that you want to visit in the near future as well.
Yeah, I think that's actually a really important point about it, as well as that by going out and putting the effort in to find these fixtures and watch them, you might actually find something you enjoy. You might find a club that's local to you that you didn't know about. It's all about discovery and going to find these things that might enrich your football experience, especially if you're feeling a little bit disillusioned with the game at the top flight as well. So I want to ask you, because the FA Cup is so important to you, and as someone who maybe a bit of an outsider looking in, what are some of your favourite moments from FA Cup history, both from a history perspective and from those that you have actually been alive to witness, shall we say? Because, I think we can pull out some really great moments here.
I've been preparing for this question all evening. I think I think if we start with ones that I can appreciate but didn't witness, so I think obviously the 1953 FA Cup final between Blackpool and Bolton Wanderers, where Blackpool won their only ever FA Cup 4-3, and the entire country wanted Blackpool to win because they wanted Stanley Matthews to finally have that winners' medal. Again, that's it's that side of bringing people together. You know, everyone wanted to see him have the trophy that his career deserved, and they finally got to do that. They always call it the Matthews final, but he never liked it to be called that because his fellow Stanley, Stan Mortensen, scored a hat trick, which I'm a fellow Stanley, so I represent. I respect Finlay Stanley, so I respect his wishes. But yeah, I think that's absolutely one that really does sum up the magic of it. I think an underrated one is Manchester United in 1963 because obviously 1968 was the peak of the post-Munich Air disaster rebuild, but that was the start of it. Manchester United lost 2 FA Cup finals in a row in the late 1950s, and that was their first trophy after the disaster. So it was a sign that they could build back and achieve further success. You've also got the ones I mentioned in the 1970s. Leeds obviously won their first FA Cup, and then the next season were heavy favourites to win it again when they faced Sunderland. Sunderland completely upset the odds. If there's quite an interesting conversation in a pre-match punditry, Brian Clough and Bobby Charlton are the pundits. Oh, what a lineup that is! But Brian Clough, in spite of all his hatred of Leeds, says something along the lines, "It is impossible to be anything but certain that Leeds will win it." And Bobby Charlton, obviously sensing some kind of kinship with his fellow men from the northeast, basically says, "Oh, I don't know, I'd give Sunderland a chance." And then through the fantastic acrobatics of Jim Montgomery, Sunderland found a way to do it. There's one incredible story. A few years later, you had Southampton, who had lost multiple FA Cup finals. They finally won it against the odds, against a strong Manchester United side. Like I said, Ipswich winning it, West Ham winning it as a second division team. You had Coventry and Wimbledon. I think Wimbledon is such a fantastic one because they came from non-league until I think it was like the 1960s. They were a non-league team, didn't get into Football League until then. But they rose through the divisions and managed to reach the peak by winning the FA Cup. Whatever people thought of the crazy gang, I understand they divide opinion. It is fantastic that a team could do that, come from non-league and climb all the way to the top and win the FA Cup. I think that's absolutely fantastic. You also got like your upsets in like Wrexham and Sutton around that era as well. Obviously, as the advent of the Premier League meant there weren't necessarily as much FA Cup shocks, but that does bring me more towards my era where I started watching football. And I think two that I'd particularly enjoy reminiscing about. I think, firstly, I think Leicester winning the FA Cup was such an incredible story, and I them winning the Premier League was a fantastic story. And I think this maybe almost equals that, just in like when you actually read back into it, because all those finals I mentioned, Leicester kept losing FA Cup finals. They lost 4, and all the build up to that game was just talking about them losing 4 times. As I said at the start of the podcast, a part of me inside was just like this hunch. It's like, no, they can't lose it again. They've lost it too many times. They can't allow that to happen. And then the joy that you saw, like, I get very invested in football, and like, even if it's teams, like, I don't support these teams, but I'm still watching them and getting invested in it and just cheering them on so much. And with Leicester, I actually fell to my knees at full time, so I was just so happy for them. And like how much it meant to Gary Lineker, how he was talking about how when he went to a final in the 1960s, I think it was the one Manchester United in 1963, funnily enough, he said he cried for the entire train journey home. And then to see him jumping up and down when Tielemans hit that strike, it's absolutely beautiful. So I think that's one of the best moments in FA Cup history. It's absolutely beautiful. Wigan, one I think that gets incredibly overlooked because it almost feels like something out of a TV series. Like it seems like a sort of underdog story written for Hollywood, because like Wigan, it just sounds like a team made up for something like that. But you also got the chairman who broke his leg in a final about 50 years before. He took over that club, took them to the top, and then they won the FA Cup despite going down. And I don't know Wigan fans personally, but I feel like a lot of them would say they take all the difficulties they've had in the last decade to have that trophy. Because if they didn't win that final, they probably would have had all the same difficulties, even if they stayed up. They've just gone down next season, but they'll always have that, and no one can take that away from them. but I think the most positive memory I do have of it is an oddly specific one, but it's very personal to me. It's it's quite an infamous moment for other people, but many will remember Dan Gosling's goal against Liverpool for Everton. And the reason it's infamous is because on some areas of the country, the broadcast accidentally cut out. It must have been someone in the TV studio must have slipped and pressed the wrong button because it cuts to the the little snippets you have before the ad break. FA Cup sponsored by Eon, when it must have been Tony Hibbert was running down the wing with the ball to play in a cross, and loads of people missed the goal. Now, I wasn't one of them, but essentially the context of that evening, I won't go into details. So something personal happens that like really upset us, and it was just me and my older brother in the house. It was the day before my birthday, and we just felt, well, look, let's make the most of it. Let's stick ITV and watch Everton against Liverpool. And we absolutely, for whatever reason, hated Liverpool at the time. Maybe it was some of the fan base, the entitlements, but I don't think we liked Benitez too much. There was just something about Liverpool we both just absolutely hated. So it was a kind of a form of hate watching, but it was such an incredible cup tie. It was a proper Merseyside derby, really intense. But in what must have been like the 117th minute, Dan Gosling got the ball inside the box and curled it in. And I just remember, like, it must have been about 10:30, absolutely screaming and like jumping in the air, nearly knocking my older brother to his feet. And it's just sometimes I look back at that goal and I just remember that moment very fondly. It's just a very beautiful moment that is very personal to me. But again, I think it's such a great FA Cup moment. That was the year that Everton reached the final and lost to Chelsea. But, they were underdogs going into that game, but they managed to knock them out and have that incredible moment. For me, it's my favourite personal memory of it. But I have also had the privilege to actually attend 2 FA Cup finals because the same elder brother, through his line of work, he worked for a company that allowed him to get tickets for FA Cup games at Wembley and some other games as well. But yeah, we saw Manchester United against Crystal Palace 2016 and Manchester United against Chelsea 2 years later, and that was something I always dreamed of doing. Never thought I'd be able to do it, but thanks to Jake, my older brother, I was able to do that. So thank you to him. But no, it was absolutely incredible to have done that, and I feel very privileged. I think when I entered the pearly gates, that's something I can say I did when I look back on my achievements. But yeah, those are some of my favourite memories of it. I think there's so many more, but those in particular, I think, are the ones that take the cake most.
Yeah, that's fair enough. I mean, just kind of thinking back through history, I think one of my favourites would probably be Forest in, what was that, 58, 59, 57, 58 or something like that. Because Stuart Imlach played in that final and he's become one of my kind of favourite Scottish players throughout history. I think mainly because of his story, which was, it was quite widely publicised and kind of came to the light with the publication of My Father and Other Working Class Footballers by his son, Gary Imlach, which I think won Sports Book of the Year in 2005, I want to say, sometime around then. But it's a really, really good story. But it kind of brings to light this idea that there are so many footballers who existed through the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, well into the 70s, who were effectively being exploited and treated terribly by their football clubs, who in this day and age would be making generational wealth. That's not to say they weren't making more money than some of their contemporaries in that time, but for a period in the 50s and 60s, it was better for these guys to go out and get an apprenticeship and make more money because of things like the wage cap. So it really kind of brings that story to light. But what I like most about Stuart Imlach is he came from Lossiemouth, which is a really small fishing village in the north of Scotland. I think it's up northern coast of Angus, up that direction. But then he went and won an FA Cup. Do you know what I mean? And it's just kind of one of these things, by chance there was a scout there who saw him and recommended him to someone down south, and he never played in Scotland bar junior football for Lossiemouth. It's just an absolutely incredible story. Obviously, he had Everton, I think, in the mid-90s as well. Was that man?
Yeah, 1995. Yeah.
Unreal. But then, this is what's part of the culture surrounding the FA Cup and the magic of the Cup, is the idea that despite there being a list of winners that we can go to, there's also a list of runners-up. And it's the idea that if the runners-up is an underdog by any stretch of the word, like out with the big four or big six or whatever you want to call them in England, then everyone seems to be behind the underdog because they want to see what they would call like an upset or a fairy tale story. I mean, I remember really getting behind Watford when they got to the final. What was that, 2018? 2019 or something like that?
It was
2019, and yeah, they ended up getting tanked like
yeah,
6-0.
waste of time.
Yeah, so it's just it is just an incredible competition for all these types of things that it brings out, and that does bring us quite nicely on to the culture of it, because we can talk about all these results, all these great players, and all these magnificent moments from it, but it doesn't really give justice to the feeling that you have when you're actually watching a game that you recognise will be spoken about for years to come once you've watched it. And that's kind of part of what makes intangible heritage and cultural heritage what it is. It's recognising that these are moments that have left an impact on the football that you're watching.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Because I think that was one of the key things with when I watched the World Cup final in 2022, that people would ask me where I watched that and stuff. But I think it applies so much to the FA Cup as well. I look forward to being able to tell people when I'm older about watching the stories about Leicester and Wigan winning it. But when I did the get together for the last FA Cup final, my granddad, like I said to him, like, you know, he's in his 90s now. I said to him, like, oh, what are your favourite memories of it? What's your favourite final? But funnily enough, I think I knew more. I think I had more memories of the 70s finals than he did. But no, so it's like yeah, you pass on these stories and they live on, and you know, I like to, you know, sometimes there's documentaries about old football matches on the telly. I'll say to my dad, like, oh, do you remember when you watched that? And yeah, absolutely, it passes through the generations. But interesting that I mentioned that my granddad in the cup final. The year before last, well, the key reasons I felt we needed to do a get together is he had his birthday party on the day of the FA Cup final, which I've not forgiven him for. But no, so he did his sort of thank you speech to everyone. I had the cup final on my phone just so we could all sort of look on the corner of my eye, but he stood up and said, I did write to the FA to ask them to change the kickoff time, and we did all chuckle, but he said, yeah, the year I was born, Arsenal beat a certain team in the final, I won't say who, and then after the speech he came up to me and said it was Man City. I was like, I know. Herbert Chapman's first trophy. Yeah, no, absolutely. It's not just bringing people together in the moment. It's about bringing the generations together. How kids can sit on their dad's knee and say, "Tell me what it was like when this happens." And I like to think that through the FA Cup matches we watch, when someday when we watch our kids watch documentaries about this, you can say to them, "Oh, I remember watching that. I was here." Or I was at that game, or whatever. It's fantastic to be able to discuss, and like, you know, I've got like there's also like a football clique at my work. We all talk about our memories. We remember certain FA Cup games, and it always generates memories. There's always incredible moments, and you're absolutely right. It's watching that and thinking I'll always be able to talk about this. We mentioned favourite FA Cup memories. I think last year's one was very special for the reason of having everyone together to watch that. And I do often watch the highlights just because I enjoy just thinking about us all sat in a room together, just being amazed when Kobbie Mainoo scored that lovely goal, and just the general strong memories of it. So I think as well as watching history, you're making memories together, and I think that's where football's at its best, is bringing people together.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I'd completely agree with you. And I was just thinking as you were saying that there, like, it's interesting how, like, it's never really going to be a thing for the League Cup, to be honest. It's never really going to be a thing for any of the smaller trophies. I mean, that's not to discredit, you know, some of the lower league clubs who might not have another chance at silverware, who, for example, can maybe win like the FA Vase or the EFL trophy or something. And it's something that the Premier League and other leagues in England have tried to impose within the league structures. But I mean, personally, I feel like in a 32, 36 game season, it's very difficult to look back. I mean, you can obviously identify your turning point moments, don't get me wrong, but it's not going to be knockout football, because with knockout football, you have one chance. You don't then have another 37 to make up for it. Do you know what I mean? You have one go at it, and if you do it wrong, then that's you. You're out, and you need to wait until the next season to try it again. And who knows where you or other clubs are going to be at that point. So that's part of what makes it quite special for me. But also just this idea that, and it's not just yourself, it's other families. They see this as the showpiece event of the season, and I think that's what I think this is what plays into part of the culture of the FA Cup so much, is that it is the showpiece event of the season because it's literally the last fixture in the calendar.
Yeah, well, it's that's how it should be. Unfortunately, they've made these changes. I mean, it takes place the week before the last game of the season, which has really irked me. It's not the first time this has happened, but no, I agree. It should be the showpiece of the domestic season. I think it just makes sense. The order should be Premier League finishes, FA Cup finishes, Champions League, and other European competitions finish after that. But no, you're right. It is the culmination. It's like it should be. Everything has been building up to this moment. I would say to people, it should be to England what the Super Bowl is to Americans. I think the Premier League is a fantastic thing for all its flaws, but obviously by the time of the final weekends, the winners may be decided. It's very 50-50 whether you have a tight race going into the last day. But the FA Cup, it's a final. Anything could happen. You've got a thrill. There's no guaranteed winner when you walk out on that pitch. But yeah, no, I think it should be the showpiece of a domestic season. And I think, like I was saying earlier, it's just great that, when the competition starts, it's being played on tiny fields with stands that look like bike sheds, and it's like because everyone can trace their way to some sort of connection to the final. I think what my friends and I were all doing when that year when Cheltenham played Tottenham, it was Tottenham got to semi-finals and they lost 5-1 to Chelsea, and I believe Juan Mata had a shot that didn't cross the line. This is one of the things that made goal line technology happen. The referee gave the goal. I don't actually blame the ref. It was very 50-50. He had to make a decision. But there's a connection, even if you're pulling at strings. You think, Tottenham played Cheltenham. Tottenham got to semi-final. Chelsea beat them, and this big thing happened. Chelsea went on and won it. Without Cheltenham, that wouldn't have happened. You see what I mean? You make all these connections. But yeah, I think I think you've mentioned the Scottish Cups as well, and I think there's a lot of parallels to that. I think that is also a huge part of the footballing calendar, because I think if the FA Cup is Neil Armstrong, then the Scottish Cup is Buzz Aldrin. It came right after it and has its own incredible history. I'm sure you know far more about it than I, but I've read up a lot on it and I find it really interesting. And I think my favourite story from it is obviously Hibernian from about 9 years ago. I think that was an absolutely beautiful story. I've done a video covering that, and it might be like my favourite one I've made. But this is what I mean. The FA Cup sort of passed on that magic to other competitions, but I think it's something that we could only capture in a bottle in like the British Isles, because I think only the DFB Pokal seems to have transcended some of this magic. I think this year you've obviously got Stuttgart against. Do forgive me, but I can't remember their name. But there's also this third division side. Some of the magic has been able to transcend that. But with like the Coppa del Rey, Coppa Italia, I still think they're good competitions. Don't get me wrong, but they're more seen the way we see the League Cup. It's good if you win it, but it's not the end of the world if you don't. Whereas the FA Cup, it takes a special prestige.
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to do another episode in the Scottish Cup, to be honest, but it would very much follow the same format as this one, because the SFA tended to follow what the FA were doing for so many years, and the Scottish Cup has also transcended that, except that, like as I kind of alluded to earlier in the episode, it's nuts if you look at the history of the Scottish Cup, because one season I think you have something like 32 clubs competing, and this is in like the late 1800s, and then the next season there's like 122, and then the next season there's like over 300, so it grew very, very quickly. But you also had a lot of teams scratching in the early rounds, because one, they didn't see the value in it, but two, because of the travel distances and stuff like that. But I mean, Hibs 2016 I think will be one of the greatest Scottish Cup memories out there for Hibs fans and for others as well. I mean, you're ending 100+ years of torment for not winning the trophy. I also thought, I mean, man, there's just so many that I could go through, but Queen's Park are still the third most successful Scottish Cup club in the country behind Celtic and Rangers, which I think tells a deeper story and talks to kind of deeper issues that maybe we can explore further on a Scottish Cup episode. I mean, just before we wrap things up, Finlay, what does the FA Cup mean to you?
I just think it represents what football should be all about. It's about dreams coming true, fighting against the odds, giving you something to get through the week. But yeah, just bringing people together. I just think there's kind of, it just has to be seen to be believed, because I can talk about how magic it is until the cows come home. But I think if, say, you were exposing someone from like Spain, Italy, or Germany, like they come over to England, and you want to explain to them how it's different from their domestic cup competitions, I think you just have to get them to the games, watch them, and just see how different it is. But no, there's just, I think every season there's always at least one incredible story if you just look hard enough. Even if Manchester City win it by 6-0 in the final, you'll still find something amazing there. A team who secured their future by having an underdog victory, teams that went on a great run, a young player who scored a goal in their debut. Just so many great things that come out of it. And I think the final is just such a unique event, and I love the romanticism of it. But it's I could ramble on about it all night, but I think the top line is it's just not like anything else. And I look forward to Saturday watching Crystal Palace against Man City. I wish Palace all the best. Fingers crossed they can finally win it and break because I think they've overtaken Leicester now. It's probably the unluckiest team when it comes to FA Cup finals. But fingers crossed they can win it. But I think it would be beautiful, because it would be another fantastic story, and it would just show the FA Cup isn't dead. I think Leicester helped us do that, but maybe it's time for a new underdog. Fingers crossed Palace can do that. Let's see if the footballing gods abide with them.
100%. I think, just to bring this episode, full circle, and very much like the FA Cup brings a season full circle as well. I've always found it interesting how when the full time whistle goes, there's celebration, and then something hits you that actually this is the end of the season now. Obviously not now that they've swapped the fixture dates about, but normally you're well, that's things done now, we're into pre-season and all that. But yes, hopefully Crystal Palace can get a result and add what would be another phenomenal chapter into the history of the FA Cup. Absolutely magical tournament, which provides all these great memories and moments, and has a really unique culture around it, which I think I do think that every single football fan in at least England can relate to, in terms of what it brings them, their families, their friends, the conversations that they then have with people. It's just a really, really unique part of what football culture and our football heritage is, and I don't think we can take it for granted. It's also why so many people were upset when these proposed changes were made earlier on in the season as well. So let's hope for a good final when it comes, because by the time this episode's out, the final will have already been played. So here's hoping it's at the very least entertaining, and Palace can put up a bit of a fight if they're not going to win it. But Finlay, this has been another fantastic conversation. Thank you very much for joining us once again on the podcast. If anyone wants to get in touch with us to discuss anything that we've brought up in this episode, then you can do so by DMing us on X. That's @_footyheritage. Or you can email us at hello@footballheritage.co.uk as well. Thank you once again to all of our listeners who have tuned in for this episode. But for now, Finlay, say goodbye.
Goodbye.
It's goodbye from me as well. We'll see you all again next week. Goodbye.